Hello fellow photographers. Today we're going to be talking about file types, megapixels, DPI, and PPI. Okay, so I just threw a whole lot of words at you. So now let's take a little bit of time and figure out what those mean. Let's start with megapixel. Now you've probably heard this word before when you're buying a camera and it boasts how many megapixels it has. But what does that mean? To figure that out, let's work backwards. Take an image, and to find the megapixels of your image, you take the height and you multiply it by the width. And then you divide it by 1 million, and this will give you the megapixels of your image. There are other ways to kind of explain this, but I personally think this is probably the easiest to understand, is just to grab an image and kind of do it and figure it out. But if you still have questions, leave me a comment and I will explain it in a different way. Now, moving on to DPI and PPI. DPI is a term used in printing. It means how many dots per inch it is, how many square dots per inch it is. So DPI means dots per inch. PPI is the digital equivalent of DPI, meaning pixels per inch. Pretty much it means the same thing. These two numbers will often be used interchangeably, but PPI generally refers to digital pixels per inch, and DPI refers to printed dots per inch. When you're printing an image, the common DPI to use is going to be 300 DPI for most printers. Some are capable of doing 600 or some even more, but the chances that you will need that are often very rare. Most people won't even be able to notice when a picture was printed at a higher DPI than 300. And in some cases, you can even go lower than 300 without too much noticeable quality loss. And speaking of going lower, most images that you see on the internet or videos you see on YouTube or even in movie theaters, most of those are going to be 72 pixels per inch. The reason for that is you're choosing the resolution that the image is going to be displayed on. If you're looking at an image on your phone, then chances are 900 DPI is going to look the same as 72 DPI. You won't notice the extra quality, and you're just adding such a larger file size to it that it's really not worth it. So I would say the most common PPI to use when you're editing is going to be 300. This is also most likely the standard that your camera is going to be shooting its images at. Now that we spent a little bit of time covering DPI and PPI, let's jump into file types and talk about those. There are so many file types out there that I'm only going to talk about the most popular ones. What I've done was selected 5 images that were all shot in RAW, and I saved them in different file formats. Then I went through and I edited them in those formats. That means there is no loss of quality from the camera since they all have the same settings. So now let's jump into that. Okay, so the first image we're going to look at is the RAW image. This is unedited and it is 47 megabytes. Its compression is lossless, which means that you're not losing any quality with this file type. It does technically support transparency when you're editing it, but not in the way some of the others will. This file type cannot be used on a web page without first saving it to another file type. And while it doesn't support layers in the traditional way that you may think of with Photoshop, you can still edit and mask inside of Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. The second image is going to be a PSD. This is a Photoshop document file and it is 131 megabytes. The file compression is also lossless, so we have no loss of quality with this format. It does support transparency as well as layers. So the first two file types are the ones that I will personally choose for editing all of my images. PSD is a format for editing, so it's not one that you would put on the web, but it is also great for editing your image and then saving it to another file type that is web compatible. The third file type that we're looking at is a TIFF. This is 113 megabytes and it is also lossless compression. It supports transparency and layers. It is not a file type that I would use for the web page. You can treat this like an editing file type to save your files in. I personally will save my PSD or RAW files to a TIFF before I send it off to a printing lab to be printed. The fourth file type is PSB. This is exactly like a PSD file, except that it's meant for much larger file sizes than PSD. Now we're getting into probably the most popular file type, and that is JPEG. This file size comes out to only 17 megabytes. Now for the downsides. This is a lossy format, which means that you do lose some quality when it comes to using this format. It will also not support transparency, and it does not support layers. It is, however, the most popular file type to use on websites. For my website, all of my images are edited in either RAW or PSD first, and then a copy is saved to JPEG to put them on the internet. Even though there is a loss of quality, unless you're editing it after you have saved it in JPEG, you will most likely not even notice it. Now, PNG file type. This is 41 megabytes. It is also a lossless compression, so there's no loss of quality here. It supports transparency and can be used on the web page. The only downside here is that it will not support layers. I use PNG files for my graphics on my web pages. I do not, however, use this format for my pictures. The reason is that the file size is larger than a JPEG, and by the time it gets to a web page, I will not be editing it anymore, and if I decide to make changes to it, I will go back to the original format I edited the image in and save another copy. Now, GIF file format. It's coming in at only 20 megabytes, and this is a lossless format as well, but as you may have noticed, the image changed here a bit, and that's because it is not using as many colors. So while it may be a lossless format, most of the times you will be saving it to a lossy format without even noticing. This is still a good format to use on web pages because it does support transparency. It does not support layers the way the other formats do, but if you're creating an animated graphic, the GIF is the way to go. And those are a type of layer. Now, I will generally only use GIF for animated graphics. For all other graphics, I use PNG, and for pictures, I use JPEG on web pages. I use TIFF for sending out to print studios, and I edit in PSD or RAW. Now we have PDF files. This is good for creating documents. I wouldn't use this format for saving pictures too, even though it will support layers. The file size comes in at 64 megabytes. It is capable of both lossy and lossless compression. There is no transparency supported, and you technically can use it on web pages, but most browsers will create it as a downloadable link rather than just displaying it. And the last one, we're going old school, BMP. Coming in at 133 megabytes with lossless compression. It does support transparency, but not layers, and it is not recommended for web pages. As you can also tell, the color is just not there. It is missing something. I would actually say I can't think of a time in the last 15 years that I haven't even used this file type, so I would say just throw it on the back burner and kind of avoid it. Now, we're going to look at the edited files and how they change the image. Like I said earlier, these images were all shot in RAW, but then saved to various file formats before we made those edits to them. So, looking at the RAW image, the quality looks great and the pictures came out amazing. Going to the PSD file, you may be a little shocked that it doesn't look the same as the RAW file. This is because this was edited slightly different. The RAW file has so much extra information from when it was shot and makes it the most powerful way to color correct an image. If I were going to be needing to edit a photo in Photoshop, I would first edit the colors in RAW with the original file and then take it into Photoshop to do the final edits. This one, however, to keep it a fair contest, I edited this one in Photoshop using a Camera Raw filter. This is still a good way of editing if you don't have the original RAW file. I edit all the following images this exact same way. Now, looking at the TIFF file, there is no difference between the PSD and the TIFF. The same is true with the PSB. And even the JPEG edited this image way better than I was actually expecting. The PNG did a decent job as well. The GIF, however, failed in my opinion. The PDF brings it right back to looking like most of the other formats, and then the BMP let us down again. Now, I have a few other images I'm just going to scroll through here so that you can see the differences. So now that we have looked at all of these images, I just want to give you a little refresher of what we went over. First of all, talking about the file sizes of these images, we have an average file size of 129 megabytes for the BMP. We have 22 megabytes for the GIF, 27 megabytes for the JPEG, 99 megabytes for the PDF, 61 megabytes for the PNG, 129 megabytes for the PSV, 129 megabytes as well for the PSD, 49 megabytes for the RAW, and 127 megabytes for the TIFF. The smallest file size being used is the GIF, which we pretty much avoid unless you're creating an animated image. The largest three being the BMP, which you should avoid, and then the PSD and the PSV, which if you're going to make any changes to your image after you first edit it in RAW, these are the two file types that I recommend using. The next largest is the TIFF, which is also a good option to use for editing your photos and giving you a flattened copy to give to a print studio. Then the PDF is large as well, coming in an average of 99 megabytes. I would personally say not to use this format if you're just choosing format for images only. Working our way down, the next largest is the PNG, which I think is great for graphics, but I tend to avoid it just for photos. Then we have the RAW, which is where I do most of my editing. All of the photos I will take will get a run through in RAW before I save them to any other file format. Many of them I don't do any editing to after I've already edited in RAW. And then finally, the second smallest file size is the JPEG. While I wouldn't edit my files in this format, this is the go-to format for saving copies to display on web pages, Facebook, Instagram, any of your social media sites. Anyways, I hope this was informative. I'm sorry it was a little bit longer of a video, but sometimes you gotta get the boring stuff covered so you can get back to the fun of photography. Until next time, happy shooting!